controlling behavior is all about, what kind of people use control in intimate partner relationships, and how you should get out of a controlling relationship at the right time without having to experience any form of abuse in later life. We have an amazing guest on the show today. We've got Brother Bilal Ali, who is a psychotherapist, a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, and a relationship coach. And he's been offering his services to the community for the past 14 years. Let's welcome Brother Bilal to the show. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, my sister. Walaikum salam.
Thank you so much for taking the time out for our Hidayat TV and for our show today, brother.
Really pleasure to join you. Really looking forward.
Thank you. So let's jump into the topic. Most people, when they're considering someone for marriage or when they are looking out for a potential soulmate, as they say, they often fail to identify certain aspects of that person's personality who may be a narcissist, for example, or who may be somebody who uses coercive control in personal relationships. I would like you to share with our viewers, because this is a live calling show and I encourage people to call in if they have any questions or comments. How can we identify controlling behavior in an individual?
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sister, that's a very wide question, and I think that sometimes we might put a lot of pressure on ourselves when we're looking for a potential significant other, looking for a spouse. That there's a kind of like limitation, especially Islamically, in terms of the interactions and access to people and being around them and seeing them in their natural environment. There's some limitations. So how would we identify those things is very challenging. But there are some key signs and, let's say, behaviors that would kind of like lead one to believe that this person may have issues related to being a controlling person. But can we, just from interacting, having a coffee, general conversations, know that this person employed coercive methodologies? It's extremely difficult, and I hope throughout the conversation then we can slowly unpack and unravel some of those things that might kind of like naturally occur in our conversations and interactions. But there is a limitation in terms of what we could find out. But I think good thing to do is just open, honest questions around related to, for example, people's attitudes on interacting with family, for example, because one of the famous things that people do in controlling relationships in general, and this is almost is reminiscent of like what cult psychology, what people do when they enter into cults, and what the cult does. It isolates people from their general friendship group and their family, because our friends and our family, they are like our landmarks, or our kind of like a psychological markers for when we're acting a bit out of pocket, or we're acting not as, we're not ourselves, and we may not even perceive it. But the interactions and relationships we have with people, there are cues for our normality. And hey, actually, I'm feeling quite stressed. It's funny because I had a conversation with my mum, or I was talking to my best friend, and he picked up on, and that led to another conversation. And I could, like, it helps us to know where we're at, as well as our own internal self-awareness. So I don't want to say narcissists, but those who incline towards coercive control, one of the things they would like to do is isolate you from your regular group, be that family, friends, or both. So that's one of the things that like early signs for curiosity. Well, we won't say red flag, but we'll say something to be interested and find out a bit more if the person has an issue and wants to move away and isolate and be by self, and let's be away from if we do decide to get married. That's something to look into a little bit deeper.
Yeah. Where does that stem from? Is it something to do with that person's childhood? Because you come across people who often say that they've been hurt in the past, and this is why they are possessive, or this is why they are acting. They try to kind of give justifications for their behavior, because I think they are kind of aware of what they are doing, and they're also aware of the fact that this person may question their behavior. So they start justifying it by coming up with a sob story about their past relationships or maybe their childhood. How can you identify that?
Well, it's okay for people to have histories, past relationships, or past experiences. That's part of the human journey. However, if we are entering into a new relationship and I am a new person in your life, for example, then that's not really, I'm not responsible for what took place in the past. I can be caring, I can be nurturing if I know that you've been through a hard time, but that shouldn't encroach on me and I have to bend in an abnormal way to accommodate. If you have insecurities, for example, that those if a person has insecurities, male or female, and they're entering and they're considering marriage, maybe they need to go and seek personal help and work on
Mm-hmm.
those insecurities first before, because that tells me you're not ready.
Exactly.
That tells me that a lady, for example, she had a difficult time in her past marriage or engagement or whatever the case may be, and for that reason, she's insistent on needing my phone access to my phone and all my social media handles because there was an issue of trust in my past.
Mm.
I not from your past, and I do believe you may have some work to do on yourself, and it would be the same for a
Mm.
gentleman who require or demand that kind of access because I was triggered in my past. No, sir, you in all sincerity may need to do a bit of work on yourself and reconcile that before looking to partner up with somebody for that life journey that we call marriage.
So, for when it comes to forming new relationships or considering someone as your potential partner, it's always important to work on yourself first. And if you're carrying any baggage from the past, then you need to resolve those issues instead of bringing that into a new relationship, because it's definitely going to be very detrimental, isn't it?
Imagine a gentleman has his own issues unresolved, and that doesn't mean that when we work on ourselves that we are perfect. And self development is a thing of the past. That it's self development is a journey and it's not a destination. So we never arrive at that perfect, all self aware and reconciled person. But there are levels to where we can say, you know what, I know I've got some stuff to work on, or I'm aware of some of my shadow self, or some of my insecurities. But however, they're workable. They're in a what we call like a normal framework. But when somebody knows that they've been through different things in the past, whether it's from family, parental upbringing, whatever it is, and they know in themselves they are bent out of shape, or it's been brought to their attention that, hey, this is beyond the pale what you're presenting, what some of your ways of being, your behaviors
Mm.
are unacceptable. That is a cue to say, look, there's some self development that must take place. Because if two people come with a level of issues, then it's a kind of recipe for a battlefield, really. And
Yeah,
that's not what we
yeah.
want. It's not what we
And
want.
I
But we
think
but we expect two people are not going to be perfect, and having two different perspectives as a man and woman will inevitably create challenges. That's inevitable.
what else should we look out for? I mean, what else comes under coercive control? And we talked about isolating the person you're considering for marriage or you're in a relationship with. That's one of the tools of manipulation that they use. Apart from
Yeah.
that, what else is there?
So, well, apart from the isolation, but related to the isolation is the desire is, or the aim is, the objective of the one who is coercing the other is to get that person to rely on them. So that person to be a superhero in their life. They can't function without them. So there's a kind of a dependency culture
Mm,
that's set up in the relationship. Um, Men need women and women need men. And that seems healthy in marriage, right? There's a partnership and they rely on each other. But when one party tries to, because coercion is about power, it's about somebody
yes.
imposing power, right? Leveraging power, yeah, and
Mm,
using that power to force the person against their will. And that doesn't always mean we're going to get into maybe threats of violence and the difference between what we call domestic abuse and domestic violence, because sometimes they're seen as synonymous, but they're not the same thing. They are quite different. But
yeah.
yeah, one of the things that the coercer will use is a way to create a scenario where the other person is reliant on them, and that might mean using certain cycle as well as the tactics of isolating you
Mm,
from your family and your peer group and your friendship group, your siblings, whatever. The other thing is as well
yeah.
is to create a relationship where the person relies on the other party for validation, for they start to second guess themselves. This is when you get into things like gaslighting, where when there's a dispute and the person flips the blame on the one
Yeah.
that the perpetrator flips the blame, so the victim starts to second guess themselves. Am I really? Was that? Am I going over the top? Am I? They start to doubt themselves, They start to
Yeah.
rely on that person for everything, for judgment, for
Mm.
does this suit me? Does this they can't wear an outfit. They couldn't pick an item of clothing. They couldn't pick a college course. They couldn't they can't really function without that person's rubber stamp and approval.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, I'm making clear distinctions because I know in a healthy marriage that it would be normal if a husband's thinking of taking up an engineering course or something or going for a promotion. Like, of course, it's normal for him to discuss it with his wife and vice versa.
Yeah.
But when it's a dynamic where it's like, I can't even think about it properly myself until I run it by that person, as opposed to
Mm.
I've had my own ideas, but I wouldn't mind. I think I should talk to my wife about this and see what she thinks. Maybe I'm missing something. That's different from I'll need to run it by run it by her for me to even have an opinion. It's almost like that person is your opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty controlling in itself, where you don't have the freedom to make choices regarding your own life without having to not just consult but consent, taking consent from that
Right.
person.
Right. Yeah. That's the difference between the power, right? The
Yeah.
confidant. I'm so
Mm.
happy for your input, and the consent as if I will not be able to do this course or go for this promotion unless this person approves. And I'm at the and I'm it's a gut churning conversation. It's almost like the stomach acids are turning, the butterflies are turning over in my stomach at the thought of having that conversation because I really want to go for the promotion or go for the course, but I don't know if she will approve.
Mm.
I'm almost fearful. It's very much coercion is very much about power and about fear because there is
Yeah.
and power can be leveraged in different ways. Common, and this is when it becomes the gender factor kind of plays up in a sense where oftentimes coercive relationships can be seen as men dominating women, and then there's
Yeah.
that the aspect of fear of violence. So it doesn't mean that violence takes place, but there's almost a it can be those scenarios where, for example, if a wife acts in a way that is disproving to her husband and he decimates some object in the house, he hasn't touched
Mm.
her, but to see him pick up a chair and smash it to bits and march out of the house and slam the door is a very
Mm.
graphic scenario of I could be that chair. I could be next. I've seen
Yeah.
the wrong side of it. I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of it. I wouldn't want to be in the firing line. So he may never raise his hands to her. He may just stand
Mm.
in a personal space and shout at the top of his voice as a male, right? And this
Yeah.
can be extremely intimidating. This is fear of violence. So this person learns in an unconscious way, in an unspoken way, because he hasn't articulated, "I'm going to harm you," but in an unspoken way by his actions, she's learned, "Hey, I could be in the firing line, and I don't fancy that." So that's a form of coercion. But likewise, as well as some relationships, in some marriages, there are women who are violent to men, and we shouldn't really ignore that. But also, women can be coercive in other ways, where it's the man is felt to feel less than the man. Let's put it that way. The man is led to feel like she's more knowledgeable. He's a charity case. Oh, I'm from a superior family. I don't know why you was a bit of a charity. You should be lucky to be with me. If you mess up, these children here that you're seeing now, you'll be lucky if you see them again. And sometimes this is not all articulated and spelled out, but it's implicit. It's in the unspoken. It's in the hints, the
Yeah.
innuendos, and subtle remarks that person, that man might learn, that have that picture and be in absolute fear of
Mhm.
of his wife, and he too have those butterflies and stomach churning conversation pre reactions pre certain conversations.
So, if we try to distinguish healthy relationships with unhealthy relationships, people often get confused. They kind of, maybe it's a defense mechanism that they use where they kind of project things that they have experienced or they have within themselves on the other person. So, like you mentioned, that when it comes to blaming, it's like you can't even have a normal conversation without that person trying to twist everything and blame it on you. And like you said, you
Mm,
have this sense of confusion that what's happening? Was it something that I did that provoked this kind of reaction? Um,
mhm.
would it be classified as emotional manipulation?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is a very apt term because it is very much all about manipulation. Because as I emphasize that the even in the coercion, it's not the necessarily the use. The idea is not to use violence, but for
Yeah.
example, the threat of violence, or not to actually deny the access to the children, but the threat of the violence. Sorry, the threat of the removal of the access to the children, or the ending of this relationship. And the ending of this relationship can be, let's say, for example, this is quite subtle because if you are living with an abuser,
Mm-hmm.
the end of the relationship should sound like the promised land. That should be something that I've tried, and
Yeah.
this person's behavior is beyond the pale, and I would be beneficial away from this person as far as possible. So that would sound, on in a logical, rational way,
Yeah.
sounds as if that's a good idea. However, the person that is being coerced is usually discombobulated, is psychologically turned inside out, so they don't trust their own judgments. They
Right.
doubt their own ability to cope without this person because you've created a manipulation scenario where I'm so reliant on you for approval, so reliant on you for your points of view about what I should do with my life, what I should wear, where I should go, who I should associate with, who I shouldn't associate with, that the threat of you just severing ties, I don't want to be with
Mm-hmm.
you anymore. That threat in itself is going to leave me in a no man's land and very vulnerable. So then,
Yeah.
instead of that ideal scenario of being away from this person, this undesirable person, now being away from them is the actual undesirable thing because could I
Mm.
cope? Could I manage by myself? So it's pretty
Yeah.
deep psychological mechanisms and dynamics that are taking place.
One aspect was the passive aggressive side, where you may not be physically hitting the individual, the person, but it's just aggression in general. Like you could give an example, slamming doors or throwing something across the room. That's like an indirect way of saying this could be you, right? But what about the other side, where the person starts sulking and gives you the cold shoulder, and there is absolutely no communication and just neglect?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because there are some things that I would say that naturally occur, or unfortunate as it may be, but naturally occur with the challenges in marriage between two people, and but it's like to what level and to what extreme or in the context would make you understand it to be this is more than just a natural reaction in terms of that person's personality, and more like part of a bigger manipulative scheme of being coercive. But in a marriage, it's natural. Let me say, it's not uncommon for people to punish their partner. What I mean, punish
Mm,
is like by sulking or by giving a cold shoulder, for example. It's not ideal because
yeah.
communication and speaking through things are usually the best way. Or saying, "I'm not in that space to deal with it right now. I'm really upset, so I'm taking a time out." But we'll talk about. You can actually articulate. But when a person just sort of, "Hey, how you doing?" You know, I said, "How you doing?" I'm all right. And almost having to like swim through treacle or watching paint dry to get an interaction and a conversation with them. That's
Yeah.
and the sulking and the cold shoulder. Those things happen, and it doesn't have to be from a manipulative place. But when put with other signs and symptoms, then we can see it's part of a. Then we can judge if it's part of a bigger picture or something
Mhm.
deeper, or is it just a less than ideal way of communicating because this person maybe doesn't have that skill set to overcome challenges in a different way.
Would you consider this fact as a red flag if there is somebody who has had multiple failed relationships over and over again, and there is absolutely no accountability, no sense of accepting that things could have gone wrong from my side as well, but you shift the blame completely on the other person? And they provide this kind of excuse or justification for all the failed relations they've had in their life.
Actually, I think a red flag, if I'm going to use that term, is regardless of the amount of relationships failed or not, but that level when it comes to lack of accountability, I think that is
Mm-hmm.
a warning sign or a point of conversation, something to be
Yeah.
congruent and identify. Because even when we use this term narcissistic, I believe, from my understanding, um, it's become so fashionable, so trendy. It rolls off so many people's lips now. It was years ago when only clinicians and psychiatrists and people used to use this sort of terminology, and it used to be like to declare somebody a narcissist or to diagnose them as having narcissistic personality disorder. It took a long period of time. Whereas now you have, and I'm sorry to say it, but I'll just be congruent. Sometimes you have women that are in relationships with men, or they may be engaged, or some sort of acquaintance with men,
Yeah.
and it didn't work out, And then the
Mm-hmm.
first thing they say, he was a narcissist. And I'm like, he was in for, we maybe went on had a few coffee dates. Then you diagnose, like, there's something about when sometimes we use this term narcissistic and we cheat ourselves because it almost is like a Hollywood movie script where this person had a kind of fiendish psychological disorder. This was a psychopath that I was engaged with or married to. And so everything that went wrong in a relationship is his fault, right? Or her fault because they were a narcissist.
Yeah.
But what about our self-awareness? What about our work on ourselves? What about our personal growth to say, hey, we came to the table, it didn't work out for these reasons, and I believe significantly that it was because of X, Y, and Z, which this person distributed. But I must admit and own, when I did A, B, and C, it in no way helped. And this is something that I need to reform in myself for me to go forward, and something for me to reconcile and reform myself for me to go forward in a new when I decide to go into a new relationship. But sometimes when I use that label, they were narcissists or they were toxic, I'm kind of absolving myself from any opportunity to grow and
Yeah.
to own have any accountability. So that in itself is dangerous. So a lack of accountability is something that regardless of number of relationships is something to be aware of. And even in ourselves, if we kind of like trace back in ourselves and we have our story about our relationship with our mother, our father, our ex, or whoever, but is it always that the world, the globe, every time we reciting the facts, quote unquote facts, it was always the other, what they did, what they did, what they did. I used to work I worked in a prison for young people for almost 9 years. And one of the common
Wow.
facts amongst the young people, regardless of ethnic background, regardless of religion, there was a common theme, conversation, interactions, and exploring scenarios with them. And it was always, yeah, because my sister, because it was my yacht worker, because my social work was never, do you know what? Hey, I did the crime, I messed up. It was very rare. That was infrequent. But the common theme was always there was a finger that pointed to somebody else why I'm in this messed up scenario and no ownership. And that's less than ideal for us to be the best version of ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, that's something that you really need to kind of look out for. And when you talk about relationships, for somebody who uses coercive control, is it something they only use with an intimate partner or a person that they're engaged to or married to, or is it something they use with other people in their lives as well? For example, their siblings, their parents, work colleagues, or friends?
That's an interesting question. I think it would be something that a person is part of an individual's personality has come part of their way of interacting. But let's say the
Yeah.
crucible or the high point would be that most intimate relationship where it show up to the most. Um, but somebody who is a manipulator, that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like how they've learned somewhere in the development, they've learned certain ways of operating, and they kind of like it plays out in different relationships. So there's a common theme. Somebody that's aggressive is often aggressive in certain relationships. Somebody that's an empath and always a people pleaser. It's not just their
Mm-hmm.
spouse they try to please. They could be like that with their parent or their siblings. So we own these ways of being in our relationships, and they can be quite across the board. But most extreme, oftentimes most extreme in that interpersonal, partner romantic relationship. Maybe because of the time factor, the physical
Yeah.
closeness, the amount of time that people spend together, and when you're married, obviously you're like literally, each other's best friends and really in each other's spaces. So yeah, it will really show up like that.
Because often people say that when it comes to coercive control or controlling your partner or your spouse, that's something that only happens behind closed doors. But in front of the rest of the world, you've got a totally different persona. You're the most approachable, friendly, altruistic, down to earth, grounded person ever. And
Hmm.
these people are quite like they love to mentor others, to coach others, or what have you. But when it comes to their own private lives, there's a different story altogether.
The, the Jekyll and Hyde, the switch,
Oh
the
yeah,
switch.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's a scary bit. That's a scary bit. Because
yeah,
how'd you
yeah,
figure
yeah.
that out? How'd you figure that out?
Um, Well, I think the origins of where this comes from is from a very because obviously these people who are who exhibit these traits and have been found to, because I mean sometimes it can even go to being coercive in a relationship can border into the as opposed to just being socially inappropriate or undesirable, an extreme
Mm.
ends, it can work out to be considered like a criminal offense, right? And but I think so. We think of these people as perpetrators, right? And and at worst, criminals at times, but like not nice people. But if we really unpack and dig, a lot of this comes from places of insecurity. A
Mm.
lot of this comes from places. It comes from a place of weakness. It comes from a place. Oftentimes, it comes from a place of their insecurity and needing to put that they project their insecurities onto that partner and put them in a weaker place. So in other words, I'm going to just use a kind of stereotype. So if there's a guy, for example, a gentleman, and he has
Mm.
now married a woman, but she's quite beautiful and quite accomplished, that could be something to celebrate, right? And be quite, hey,
Yes.
I hit the jackpot, so to speak, right? I've got that kind of wife. But for some, it may trigger in them their feelings of I'm actually quite self-conscious about the way that I look, or maybe I'm not as accomplished and I've failed in certain things and I have my own insecurities. And so now being married to a person like this, who people celebrate, it's actually making me feel a bit powerless. So as opposed to me being inspired to say, hey, I'm a bit competitive. I'd like to be the top dog. I'm going to work on myself, or I'm going to push myself. I'm going to put in the 16-hour days. I'm going to read and I'm going to go to seminars and I'm going to find stuff online and drive myself to be the best version. It's more like I think I'll have to pull her back down a bit in check. I'll
Mhm.
have to try and project my insecurities onto her, so then she starts to doubt herself and lose her confidence and lose her ability to think for herself. And
Yeah.
it happens. I genuinely believe it happens. This often happens at a kind of subtle, unconscious level, and but it plays out in a certain way. So it's not as if people sit there and just say, "Hey, I've got a brilliant wife and I'm insecure, so let me mess her life up. Let me just be a horrible guy." I don't think it works like that. I think it comes from an unconscious drive, and so people are kind of acting on automatic pilot.
Yeah.
Survival. It's like a kind of survival technique. This is how they survive and deal with life.
Are they aware of this, that they are doing this, or they're feeling insecure, or is it something that happens by default? They've done it all their life and they're not conscious of this.
I actually think that it's less conscious. I think that it comes from an absence of self awareness. I think that all they're thinking about, they're driven by results. I don't feel
Okay.
good, and by keeping this person in check allows me to feel better, or it doesn't trigger my insecurities, and that's about it. It's very. They may use sophisticated methods and techniques to accomplish the results they want, but I don't. I just got this belief that it's coming from a kind of more of an unconscious place, and it's because we're creatures of habit. Human beings are very much creatures of habit, and when we fold our arms in a certain way, for example, we just do that in an unconscious way. And if you say to somebody, now fold your arms, is kind of awkward. So taking on new ways of thinking and new ways of being takes a certain level of effort. So these persons learn these kind of adaptive or maladapt, but they learn these ways to survive from a child, of how to interact, how to intimidate their peers, or how to beguile their peers, or whatever. But all they knew, they were getting certain results that was feeding a certain need inside, and so
Yeah.
they just learned to operate in this way.
You mentioned it's all about power, it's all about control. And I don't know if this boosts their ego or makes them feel special. I don't know what the reason or underlying cause is. But say, for example, somebody is involved with a person who shows these traits. Is the only solution to leave, or is this something that can be worked upon?
So there's a PhD psychologist, Dr. Claplow, who has talked about not narcissistic, but coercive relationships in some great detail, outlining the signs and symptoms, and has alluded to the fact that it is possible, but extremely
Challenging.
challenging. Yeah, it's extremely challenging. It's extremely challenging, and it would, you know, um, and there's an argument also to say, one, is it that your responsibility, but maybe there's feelings involved, and two, are you strong enough? Do you really know what you're signing up for? And
Mm.
three, is that person genuinely? Do you believe that that person genuinely is aware, has been made aware, and is willing to accommodate? But because of things to do with violence against women, there's a very popular school to say, "Hey, girl, get the heck out of there," because unfortunately, there's many women that die
Mm.
by the at the hands of their intimate partner,
Partner.
spouse,
Right.
boyfriend, whatever the case, partner. Yeah, so um, there is a strong, really strong school of thought of if you're involved with this type of scenario, get the heck out.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Because where there is an obvious threat of physical harm or death, then that is the ultimate, like the only option to leave, to find a safe space. Because no one
Mm,
should feel unsafe in the within the four walls of their own houses. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
nobody. Healthy relationship doesn't mean to walk on eggshells or hand grenade. You should feel comfortable in your own skin. You should feel that you are in a safe place where you can communicate, you can be yourself. But I think the moment you start feeling that, oh, I cannot be myself anymore, I think that's what I call a red flag in
yeah,
itself.
yeah, yeah. Because I mean, like everybody has a right to. We all have certain rights, where it's and one of them is like a right to safety, but not only to be safe, but to feel safe.
Hmm.
So there's always this thing about, and this is what I mentioned earlier on. I want to come back to this. There's domestic abuse and then there's domestic violence, and sometimes people see them as synonyms, as being identical, but they're not, because domestic violence is referring to specific acts of violence,
Yes.
and physical assault. Um, Whereas domestic abuse could cover the psychological, it could cover financial, it could cover other emotional, it can cover other
Yes.
aspects of where people
Religious,
actually.
spiritual. Yeah.
Yeah, there's levels of abuse. There is, for example, the psychological abuse where people when they talk about narcissistic personality and the techniques of a narcissist, they say, for example, love bombing.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
where the
Initially.
person is showered with all these affections, showered with quality time, showered with gifts, and then out of the blue, the other partner would go missing or stop returning calls or whatever, and then that would lead the person to sort of second guess themselves. But it's almost like a drug. It's like a drug. It's almost like forming a drug dependency. Every time you see an emoji from that person, every time they speak to you, they tell you these great things about yourself. So there's all these endorphins being released in the person, in the one who's receiving all these compliments body. So they're high, literally. The dopamines are being released in their body, right? When people fall in love, it's all like dopamine and cortisol being released, right? There's people are high like they're on cocaine. But then when
Mm-hmm.
that's cut off, it's like the
Yeah.
drug dealer's gone missing. It's like they're now sniffing and scratching around because they need a hit.
Mm.
And this happens in other forms of in for example domestic abuse relationships where the person doesn't know that the victim doesn't really know what side to expect, because he for example, or she is not just abusive, is not just aggressive, he's not just horrible and putrid with their words. But sometimes they can be so nurturing and so kind. And so what
Yes.
happens is that the one that is dependent is always looking for. It's like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They're always looking
Yes.
for, or they're always looking for the superhero to turn up,
Mm-hmm.
but not the other side, not the dark side.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
This
that
is
that's the what I call it's like it just messes up your brain completely, because the person on the receiving end is the one who's totally confused as to what's happening, like what went wrong. Initially, everything was going perfect, and they would just show up randomly on your door with a bouquet of flowers, and now suddenly there's this the cold shoulder, like nothing happened, no arguments, no fight, nothing, out of the blue.
and this is part of that wider gaslighting process, right? It could be seen as that wider gaslighting process where um, not that I'm being blamed, but I'm left wondering if I've done something wrong. So it's kind of like implicit. What, hey, I'm kind of inferring from this person's actions that I've done something to upset them. Because if two people are in a romantically connected and things are going well and communication channels are going well and everything
Mm,
seems fine, if there is a conflict, right?
yeah.
People have a disagreement, it gets a little bit heated. Hey, that's life. I come
Yeah.
home later on, and the person's my other half is not so talkative. I get it. I
Mm,
get it. They would cheat stuff from the argument. They might need 5 minutes. Or if they say that, I'm really upset right now. I get it.
Mm,
But whatever it is, or it's not you, but I'm just going through some stuff. I just need a minute, so don't feel any way. But this is the case, right? People are engaged. They might say, if you don't hear from me for a couple of days, I'm just switching off
mm,
from social media because I'm really on, stuff with my mom or whatever. You get it.
yeah.
But if you just get radio silence when things were very cool, very good, then it's natural to think, hey, did I say? Is it me? Did I say something I said? What did I do? And the second guessing, And as I said, some people are not good communicators, so they may be going through things but don't know how to articulate and express. So one could be left on the
Mm,
receiving end, with that same feeling, but they're not coming from that place of trying to impact and get a certain result. They literally just don't know how to communicate and they're trying to survive, and that's different from the one who is using it as a way to
control
affect,
the person. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
to affect control. That's using it as a marker of power to influence somebody else's behavior. Yeah.
What else is there to look out for? As in, say, for example, during the engagement period, when you're getting to know somebody with the intention of getting married.
Could be feelings of instability
Mm-hmm.
that is triggered by that person. And I'm always going to make the distinction between, yes, when families are negotiating and
Yeah,
conversations are being had, um, disagreements about dowry or meher and all kinds of things. It's challenged, right? It can be challenged.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but this instability I'm talking about is almost like where we think we've got a date, we think we've got the hall, we think we've got the sheikh, everything is all booked, but then the other person pouts and then pulls a stunt like, and if this doesn't happen, I'm not going through with it. It may not be
Yeah,
expressly, but it's almost like, hey man, I've kind of put my life on the line. I've invited people from abroad, but if I don't capitulate to this person's request, everything's going to be panned. Then this is like something to maybe something to look into a little bit deeper what that's about, because you wonder how that you have to wonder to yourself, well, how will that play out later on when there are more um, more life impacting things to be worked through, differences to be worked through. If we're gonna call off the wedding because you wanted white roses and I said 100 red roses or whatever, but some things where you might think, in the grand scheme of things, how important is this for us to you know pan, and it's
like
always used as a weapon. you know
looking at the bigger picture rather than being
Yeah, the
obsessed.
minutiae, the detail of the picture. Yeah,
Mm,
and
yeah,
and these are and very much the markers about power. So maybe the things to consider is when you're considering a significant other is, how do you deal with difference? It's dealt with in a way where, even if we're going to argue, like debate about why I think music is better than yours, that's different from if it's not, this is my way, but really even want to discuss it. This is what I need to happen. If it doesn't happen, then I want to level or react in some sort of way against you by switching off communication or changing the tone. These are things that are, again, doesn't suggest somebody's they have all these traits of being a potentially coercive
yeah.
partner, but these kind of behaviors need to be called out and explored and have a conversation around, because that's some what you're doing when you're courting. It's almost like what they say when you're in court. In court, you look for evidence. So when two people are courting, they're kind of looking about the evidence of this person's character and how they deal with happiness, their level of morality and spirituality, but also how they deal with conflict, how they deal with
Mm-hmm.
differences, because that's a big part of relationship, is dealing with differences. I think it's Jordan Peterson, the psychologist, that says, we want to teach our children all manner of intellectual things when they're young and understanding different things. But he said one of the most important things that children need to learn from, I think, 0 to 3 is how to play with other kids and how to be liked, just how to get on with people. You know,
Yeah.
some people are very competent, very skilled, very intelligent,
Mm,
in terms of systems and bean counters and abstract ideas or whatever the case is, but they have very, very poor people skills in interacting and getting along with people. And
yeah,
that's what
yeah.
life is made up of: getting along with people. Life is made up of relationships. It's not
Of
always a
course.
person that is most qualified and decorated that is
Mm,
successful, as much as some people who know how to forge relationships and, hey, we've reached an impasse which is very difficult, and they know how to create a scenario where we can navigate it and we can win-win. as opposed to those who are just purely intellectual and they just dominate and ride over everybody. People don't like them.
Yeah. 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 Because people want to be free in a relationship. When I say free, as in psychological free, they don't want to be a captive to someone, they don't want to be imprisoned. I think this is what a healthy and an unhealthy relationship differs, because it's how you feel about yourself and the other person.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. People want to feel free. People want to feel appreciated. And yes, and even coming back to power, there's never going to be, I believe, between men and women in heterosexual marriage. There's never going to be this 50-50. It's not going to be
Mm.
like that.
Yeah,
There's going to be difference in power, and because the male is not like the female, and the female is not like the male, as Allah has
of
said. So
course.
we can't have it like this mathematical equality, but
No.
you want to have understanding that there's something that this person brings up value and this person brings up value, that there's a kind of equity between the two. So one excels in this particular sphere and the other excels in this particular sphere. And this shortcoming here is helped by this person's acceleration and so, and so the like. So you kind of balancing each other out and building each other. But yeah, there will be there will be somebody, there may be more power that lies with one than the other. But is that power used to protect and to serve the marriage, or is it used to level and abuse? Because power
Mm.
exists, right? The state
Yeah,
has
of course.
power. The leader has power, for example. They have arms and stuff like that. But we accept it living in civil society, and we sign up to submit to those that acquiesce to those rules. That hey, the army will have, the military will have guns, and the police will have, but it's to protect and to serve society. So for
Exactly.
the greater good, we're all right about that. So them having a
Yeah.
bit more power in that respect, yeah, it's all right.
Mm.
But it's part and parcel. But we
Yeah, it's just
revolt and we rebel and we have a revolution when those in power use and abuse that power. Then we're going to have a breakdown of society, and we're going to have a French Revolution or a Russian Revolution, or you know. So
it's
same
just like
same in marriage.
yeah, Islamically, the man has been given an upper hand, but that's for a reason, because they are considered as someone who are the maintainers and the providers for the family, for the wife, for the children. But if they start misusing that power, that authority, by controlling unnecessarily, like, oh, you can't go out of the house, you can't meet your friends, your family, then that, like you said, is misuse of power and authority. And another thing that you like highlighted about the spiritual aspects of an individual, people often confuse spirituality with religion and religiosity with piety. They're two separate things. A person may be praying 5 times a day, praying salatul layl, fasting, and do everything that's highly recommended. But then when it comes to treating people, when it comes to akhlaq, they have like the worst way of treating people. There's this element of arrogance and self absorption, self love, where they often neglect other people and treat them in a manner that you wouldn't even treat an animal, let alone a human being. So,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
emotional intelligence different to intellectual, and being religious is different to being pious? Because that's what we are supposed to look out for in a potential spouse, right? That you should marry the one who's the most pious.
And that is such a subjective in a way, subjective in terms of I don't think there's a objective template, because what people may prefer and be inclined to is going to be influenced by what they see and they perceive. But I really take your point that there sometimes as Muslims, because some of us are able to follow, or the more that we follow the formalistic, the textbook recommendations and go beyond the mandatory thing, or we manage the mandatory things. And yes, I've been to Hajj and I pray 5 times a day, and then we add on even the extra acts. But are those things piercing the heart, or those things that are just reinforcing the nafs to be puffed up? The shaitan is busy. The shaitan are busy, and we have to always be on guard against things like that. But I would say that you sometimes you meet people who are extremely spiritual and extremely, you feel like in their presence, you know that you're around somebody spiritual and they're good people, but they may have a few textbook, let's say, shortcomings that are apparent. And but like by the flip side, you meet people who you know that they are on the mandatory and the supererogatory things, but they just don't seem warm or charitable in their spirit, or they don't seem they have any kindness. And so, it comes back to self development. It comes back to self development, always questioning and challenging ourselves, holding ourselves accountable, and being about integrity, being the things that we say as much as we can, let our actions kind of like mirror that as well.
I don't think Shaitan is that busy because Shaitan has so many representatives on earth. I think they've just taken a step back and they're just like observing, letting people do their own thing. But yeah, I mean, this is quite challenging for most people, especially young people, where they look at a powerful figure or somebody with authority who appears to be very religious and holier than thou and rest of it. But when they have personal experiences or personal interactions with this individual, it's a totally different ball game. Like, um, they're not at all approachable, not at all kind, very disrespectful, and that tends to put a lot of young people off because they perceive the person who's representing, for example, a faith or a faith leader as as religion itself. Although they are again two separate things, you can't look at the followers and judge a religion, but people do that.
It's an easy mistake to happen. You can understand how it happens if somebody wears a particular garb and they represent a certain institution. If they do something untoward and it's in the public domain, people can be devastated because it's almost like the religion took a knock when it's really just this individual shortcomings, or this organization as an organization, it's just the shortcomings of a few members of the board or whatever it is. But we oftentimes we can see things like that and be quite disturbed as religious people when if things are like exposed or come out like that, it can be really, really troubling. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't affect the Quran and the teachings of Islam in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Really, then those are the foundations.
Because I've come across a lot of revert sisters who came to the path of Islam, for example, and then they found someone who they perceived as religious or pious, and they got married, and then they were put off by that person's behavior, and they not only left the path of Islam, they took their hijabs off, and now they are living a totally different life. But it's
Hmm.
really sad to see this. It's quite hurtful as well that someone who was so lovely and they have experienced something like this and now they've gone back. Um,
No, definitely heartbreaking. And we pray that Allah will open their eyes and give them a chance to come back to that good thing that they once really appreciated. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Anything else that you want to highlight? Anything else you want to mention in regards to coercive control?
Yeah. So one of the things that we would like to speak about is how do people empower themselves? How do people empower themselves, or to avoid um, the full on impact of this? Because it could be, like I said, the relationship is going through a certain stage,
Hmm.
or it's been it's manifesting itself in a certain, it's going through a particular phase, and this partner which might be perceived from the outside as a coercive controller isn't really. It's somebody who's some insecurities, and these
Yeah,
things need to be worked on, and it's not a case of run girl run, like it may be something that is able to be worked on. But
yeah,
I think it's important that one of the things people should really avoid doing if they feel, think, perceive that they're in some sort of, there's a power dynamic or power play going on, is really avoid becoming isolated for whatever the reason is, because that is a kind of bedrock, yeah, in terms of technique, isolating the victim.
mm,
So if you are a man and you're becoming and you intend to get married, and your wife is trying to isolate you in whatever form or fashion, you need to, by geography or whatever the case is, you need to keep good contact with your family, friends, and peer group, and be thankful to Allah for social media, even if it means FaceTiming mom and dad every day, and whatever the
yeah,
case is. Or likewise for a woman, visiting your
mm,
parents' home regularly and keeping in contact with your siblings and keeping good relations and things of this nature. This is one of the really good ways to break the matrix, break the circuit of the controller. It just would not work. It just will not work as well. It may be a point of contention, but you
yeah,
have that right. You have that right. To keep contact with your family. That's an Islamic right. That's a human right,
yes,
and that it's important that people do that. That's one thing to really keep yourself in a good place. Because then you have these other references. You have other people who know you and can reflections of you, like you don't see yourself, or there's like an early warning system,
yeah,
and
yeah,
also for your own independence by being in contact with your regular group, family, siblings. You're not becoming solely reliant on that spouse, which is the idea of the one that is being coercive to isolate you so that you now become reliant on me. Don't You can't make your own judgments, and voila, we have control. So that's something really
What if
important
what if
to to, to
initially what if initially they were okay with everything, there was no control and there was a sense of freedom, but slowly, gradually, it went in that direction.
Hey, good point. Good point. You need to push back. That is a warning system in itself. That is like when you're driving in a car and you see the red light come on and you think, hey, I need some fuel. It's not going to run out. The fuel's not going to run out straight away, but it's telling you if you keep driving at this pace, you're going to break down. So if you see that the person is slowly trying to remove, because I think I'm reading between your questions that implicitly I'm reading that oftentimes things don't happen like that. You're not no longer to go to
Yes.
your mum's house. It never happens like
Yeah.
that. It generally happens in
Yes.
slowly. Like, I don't know why you're always going around there, and I don't know, is the food halal or the little whatever it is, but just trying to undermine the relationship and slowly remove you. So that's your petrol light. That's that red light coming on to say it's a warning sign. If you keep going at this pace and you keep entertaining their requests and become isolated, it's going to cause a breakdown. Not necessarily in the relationship, but in your relationship with your spouse, but a breakdown in your relationship with yourself.
Hmm.
So you really have to stand for keeping that relationship and that contact. And people may have a point. A spouse may have a good point to say, I want good for you Islamically, and or friends from college, for example, are they dress a certain way and they're very worldly people. So as your husband, right, I want good for you. So I'm trying to say those people are not really good acquaintances. Yeah, that, they may have a point, but it could be the husband saying, "Well, I want to empower you. If you insist on talking to them, well, why don't you make it about Deen then? Make it about Islam. You dawah them and encourage them to come to the right thing." That's a different way of approaching the situation, not just to isolate you. Or, all right, that particular group may be undesirable, and I'm being protective of you, but
Yeah.
well, yeah, of course, why don't you see your mum all the time or go and see your family, so there's a kind of balance, right? There's a difference between just trying to isolate that person. That's really the warning sign that I feel very strongly about, is isolation, because it reminds me, as I mentioned at the start, of the tactics that cults use to manipulate people psychologically. One of the things you do is you isolate the people from their regular, so when people join cults, they don't see them anymore. When we see them,
Yeah.
only thing they got time for is a cult.
It
That's
kind of
natural in a
disappeared.
relationship. Yeah. And it's natural when
Yeah.
people fall in love. Oh, they're always together. That's natural. But when it's like to the ice, like I can't contact anybody else, as opposed to I'm just so on cloud nine that I'm always with my other half. That's different from I can't see my friends. I
Yes.
can't take a
Yes.
call right now. I gotta go. I'm just cut off. Then that's a problem. That's a problem.
Any last message you would like to give now that we are about to end the program? Any final message
Yeah,
to our viewers?
I would say that it's not that deep. It's nothing to be afraid of. Like sometimes we hear these words like narcissism and toxic, and we think we're living in a Hollywood movie where, especially when they talk about toxic masculinity, that every other man is some kind of psychopath. And it's not really that. It's not really that deep. But there are organizations that can help you to become more educated and more acquainted with the signs of toxic relationships or coercive relationships, and even the NHS. If you are in threat of if you feel like you're in threat of domestic abuse, which is more than violence, you
Yeah.
can even Google the NHS website. They have some really important information to help you not have to second guess yourself, but to get educated about what could be unsafe for you and what your next step might need to be. And that's for men or women, that if they feel that they might be a victim.
Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khairan for taking the time out and for this
One,
informative, insightful conversation.
no problem. Nice speaking with you, sister. Take care. Masalam.
Jazakumullah. Thank you. Assalam. And to all our viewers, thank you for joining us once again. Inshallah, I'll see you next Saturday, same time, 12 p.m., with another episode of Aagahi. Till then, look after yourselves and especially your mental health. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.